Okay, folks, how are we all doing again? Excuse me. God, dry cough. COVID-19? Absolutely not. No, I just had a test done on Saturday, so a PCR full, um, yeah, full test and all clear by all accounts. Didn't get any phone call today, which was expected if there was any negativity and all that sort of stuff. But in any case, so lecture number 3. So what I'm focusing on this one for you folks is the organizational learning. Now, I've already introduced you to the business model canvas, and the and it's in quite detail. Now, there are a number of video clips that you can look at as well on your Moodle site. They're based on small segments or short video clips of each of the segments that are explained and concepts of the business model in Canvas. You can look at them. There's more so for curiosity rather than a necessity to have to learn stuff, because what I've given you already on the business model canvas is more than sufficient for by way of explanation and of the process and the methodology itself. So, as you remember, one of your assessment criteria talks about learning organizations and the interaction between the business model canvas and organizational learning. And this is the side I want to take you down today and go into more depth, because it's quite a fascinating subject, to say the least. Well, in my mind, but for the most part, organizations do need to learn. And yeah, so before I get into it, let's drop down to your environment. Okay. So here we are in your favorite location, as it is from now on at least, and I'm just going to pop out the PowerPoint and get the ball rolling, so to speak. Okay, I will enlarge this even a little bit more. And there we have it. So we're ready to rock and roll for organizational learning. So really what's behind all of this is that, you know, in its simplest definitions of organizations, group of people that come together with a skill sets, competencies, abilities, and so on and so forth, that produce something. So it's a collective of people with a common objective and so on. But in this process, we all have different skill sets, we have different competencies, experiences, knowledge, and so on that we bring to the organization. And as the organization evolves, it gets bigger, more people coming in, and existing people becoming more and more experienced, it's essentially learning. It's learning what it's doing, and it's looking at ways of becoming better at doing what it's already doing. And that collective knowledge is greater than the sum of all the individual parts, as you might have often heard that expression. And it's how we try and enable this learning process within inside an organizations is what's critical. And in many cases, it's critical to the survivability of the organization. You know, particularly if it's knowledge intensive. You know, software industry, for example, even in products. We have to be constantly coming up with new products, new variations of products, next generation, new features, and so on. Even with services, what can we add? Because if you're doing the same old thing day in, day out, people become bored of it. There are expectations. So we need to learn how we do these things and do these things more efficiently. And it's the way we learn is what's important here. And there are so many different mechanisms that we can actually use in terms of organizational learning. And I'm going to just bring you through some of them and bring you through the journey of this. So what are our learning objectives? Well, first to explain the common theories on how we learn as individuals, then to describe the difference between discussion and dialogue in team learning. Okay, and you would hear an awful lot of this going on around colleges and companies and so on. You have team-based learning and action learning and so on. And then to distinguish between the process of knowledge acquisition, information distribution, information interpretation, and organizational memory. And then finally, to assess the role of politics in organizational learning. Okay, it exists. There are politics, no matter what way we part of the organization or what part of life we exist in. There are all sorts of politics, and that's human behavior. Really, we're alluding to here in terms of politics and how it can either enable or disable knowledge, organizational learning, knowledge sharing, distribution, and so on. So it has a very powerful impact on people and groups. So you have, for example, one of these techniques, a buzz group. How do you learn best from as an individual? Have you ever explored your learning style? Again, and if so, how would you describe your optimal learning environment? Now, that's pretty loaded slide in many respects. So, how do you best learn as an individual? That comes down to our learning styles, which is the second point there. And really we need to every so often we should carry out these psychometric tests or evaluations on ourselves. But most of the time we already know. We have a fair insight into how we learn stuff. Now, again, I'm speaking from personally, I like diagrams. I'm a very visual learner. I really don't have the patience to read chunks and chunks of books and texts and so on and so forth. I'll do it if I have to, but I prefer to show me a diagram. And over the years, that has actually proved to be one of my own strengths in terms of sharing information and sharing knowledge, because when I stood back and reflected on it and analyzed how I was doing what I was doing, I found that I was taking very complex situations, whether it's a product or service, an actual situation, and I was deconstructing it into more simplified chunks, pieces, elements, and reconstituting that into a diagram. And from my own simple mind, I'd say, well, if I can do that, then perhaps I can share it with people and people can understand it because, he's made it simpler. And now we understand what was previously very complex, now is easier at least to understand. But it didn't just stop there. I would have gone further back and I said, well, what really kicked this off? Why did I have this particular fascination with that style of learning? And I can actually trace it back to my pretty much early mid-teens when I was in secondary school. And I, by happen chance, saw a program on a Sunday afternoon given by a popular psychologist at the time, Tony Buzan, and he was talking about mind maps. Now, I'm sure you've come across mind maps and you're probably using some kind of software. If you are, I say forget about it. I'll come back to that again. But I was manually drawing these mind maps and I was taking my history lessons on one particular occasion using mind maps. I was actually kicked out of class. And the reason was that everyone else was taking pages and pages of notes, and here was I drawing these little circles and interlinking branches and so on and so forth. And my teacher at the time was not impressed and sent me home. And of course, my mum, who was alive at the time, was wondering what the hell I was being sent home for. And I explained that. She said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, Mark, here's a note. Get and apologize and get back into class," which I did. And but not. And I had to continue taking notes the way everyone else was doing it with longhand, pages and pages, while the teacher dictated stuff out of the book. But there was another twist of that little story. At night study, we went to night study from 7 till 10 o'clock every night. Apart from doing our 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon in school, we went to night study. I would take those physical notes and reconstitute them into a mind map. So what used to be books and books or pages of text, I was synopsizing down into these mind maps, 1-page mind maps. It had a double benefit. It was that I had to read and understand the stuff to be able to put it into the mind map. That in itself, that process in itself, enabled me to get a more clear understanding of what I was trying to learn, and actually helped me to learn what I was reading and so on and so on. But it also meant that I was able to refresh my memory by just looking at these mind maps and saying, oh yeah, that's what this means and that's where that goes, and I can see the connection there. This all makes sense in my mind. Okay, which you might say is probably a crazy place anyway, but nevertheless, it's in my mind, and I was making sense of this. So you know, it is important to get an insight into how you actually. Other people like to as I say, read. They like to be spoken to. They like to have the auditory. So you have the VARC system. That it can you can do any of these online tests on in relation to your learning style and what's your preferred style. That's not to say that we only have one style, most certainly not. We actually have might have 2 or 3 different styles of learning, but we have a dominant style of learning, and depending on circumstances, like here for example, you're learning primarily through visual and auditory stimulus. You're not asked to sit down and physically read, although you're doing some reading of the parents. You've been supplemented with my voice and in terms of your auditory reception of what's been spoken and described. So, you know, we have all these multiple styles. Some people like to go away and huddle into a corner and just read books. Some people will just go onto YouTube and so on. So you have different styles. And one of my favorite, how to say, authors and is Kolb. Kolb uses this, what's known as the learning cycle, Kolb's learning cycle. And it's another way of showing how we actually, so we observe stuff, okay? Then we carry out, we get some kind of concrete experience, we go up and we do it. And then we test, we look at our concepts and we think about it, is this the best way to go about it? And then we form an abstract, an idea, and then we go off and we test it out. In actual fact, there's something wrong with that diagram, and I can tell you that straight off, these 2 elements here, see this? Concrete experience and formation of app, they're the wrong way around. An observation. Now, I'm not going to correct it because I'm in mid-recording, but concrete experience should be over here, and formation of abstract thinking should be over here, concepts in general. So if we think of it this way, we start on with the formation of an abstract concept. We have an idea, we think of stuff and so on. Then we go out and we test it, and we in testing it, when we're finished testing out our idea and say, yeah, that works, or it doesn't work, then we get concrete experience. Okay, we understand, we say, yeah, I know. This is how it's done. I've tried it out, I've tested it, and I know how it works, and now I have the experience. And then we observe again. We look at things and say, well, can I do it differently? Or might reflect on, oh, I did it that way. I wonder if I do it slightly differently the next time around, and so on. So it goes around in this circle. Formulation of an idea or a concept or a process, and then we go up and we test it, we implement it, we try it out, and then based on that we have an experience. So we put in our thoughts into action. Now we have an experience, and based on that experience, then we'll sit back and we'll observe and we'll think about it and reflect. You could also start slightly up here and think, well, I'll observe, I'll watch somebody doing something. I'll watch how somebody is doing a piece of work. Then I'll develop my own ideas of how I do this piece of work. I'll go out and try it, and I'd make it my own way. So they might do it slightly different. I observe them doing something. I might make it slightly different. I'll do it, I might use different tools. And based on that testing of it, now I have experience of how I can do what that other person was doing, but I've done it in a different way, slightly different way, or very different way. Now I have experience of doing what they can do my own way. Okay, that's why it's so powerful to be able to explain it, despite the little hiccup on the diagram. So how do we learn in organizations? There is something paradoxical here. Organizations are not merely collections of individuals, yet there are no organizations without such collections. So similarly, Organizational learning is not merely individual learning, yet organizations learn through the experience and actions of individuals. So what then are we to make of organizational learning? What is an organization that it may learn? Okay, so you have individuals and you have this meta structure, an organization of all these individuals. So we have behavioral learning in organizations. So we have these two levels, which we call single and double loop, and there's actually a triple loop learning as it happens. So behavioral learning involves maintaining an organization's theory and use. So this is how we do things here. You follow this process and you just go ahead and do it blindly. Do A, B, C, and D. Don't ask questions. Don't do anything. Just go and do it. And then we have cognitive learning, which we call double loop learning, which involves questioning assumptions and values. So we begin to say, well, why am I doing it this way? Could we not do it that way? I need more information on how to go from step C to step D, and maybe from step A to step B. Could we skip step B and go from A to C? So this is where we begin to question. This is the double loop. So there's a two-way conversation. We'll use it for a moment, between you and your supervisor, or you and your mentor, or you and your lecturer, and so on. So we go through this over and back process such that we can get a clearer understanding rather than just simply following the instructions absolutely. Okay, because oftentimes we follow these instructions and we might not understand why we're doing it. We're just following the process. And that's the difference, the fundamental difference between single and double loop learning. Obviously, the more effective one is the cognitive double loop learning, where we question, examine, and get a deeper insight. And here's the fun in it. When we actually get an insight and say, well, why do we have to go, could we not skip step C? We go from A, B, D, E, and F. We'll go through those processes because this is more efficient, and it will save us time, might even save us money. And you feed that back to your colleagues, and they say, okay, that makes sense now. So we can slightly modify step C and we can change it, or we might expand step B to jump over step C and go straight to step D in the process. So now we're beginning to learn the organization, and it becomes more efficient. So we begin to share. So you share that with your colleague, that colleague shares it then with other colleagues, and the team gets to understand it. So now everyone is beginning to understand a more efficient way of doing a process that previously was less efficient, should we say. So if we look at we don't want to say success. We need to be able to explore. We need to be efficient. We need to exploit our own knowledges and maintain status quo, complacency, risk aversion, and short term. So if we don't do these things, if we don't behave and we don't learn, we become stagnant. Things don't happen. Processes don't get improved. And that's essentially what this diagram is, the difference between success and failure. And failure, mistakes, introspection, error harvesting, experimentation, and long term. So when we have failures, we need to be able to explore them, understand why didn't that work. So equally as much as it's important to understand why things do work, we need to understand why things don't work. And of course, this leads on to innovation and resilience. So the more we actually develop our understandings of failures, we look at alternative ways through innovation of avoiding a failure in future. And this is what's known as resilience, and that's quite a topical area, in particularly in the last number of years, in terms of organizations and individuals, our levels of resilience. How can we actually bounce back from a failure? And that's important. So and the importance is that we understand, or we get a deeper insight as to what went wrong and how we can avoid or change future situations to avoid something like that happening again. And of course, then when we have the other side of the coin, success is from reliability. We know that these proven methods and processes work and they're efficient, and we can exploit them, we can make them better, we can improve, and that comes through experience. We get better at doing what we're already doing. Now, this is the important point here in terms of sense making. So making sense of ambiguous situations of high complexity and uncertainty. So example, a nuclear attack. Crazy example. Involves a process of situational awareness to understand linkages between people, places, and events, and then allows inferences to be made of future scenarios. And then lack of situational awareness is a primary factor affecting human error. So what are we saying here? And I've alluded to this already earlier on when I was talking about Kolb's cycle and how we make sense of things. And I was using my example of how I make sense of the way I'm trying to learn stuff. And this is essentially what we're talking to be. So a sense of ambiguous situation. So we might not have all the data. We might not have all the information to be able to make a decision. So we have to try and fill in the gaps. And oftentimes we use our intuition, or we might use our past experiences to fill in some of the blanks that we're missing to be able to make a reasonable judgment of what course of action we must take. And this is the whole point, situational awareness. This is where your how to say, emotional intelligence comes in, where you are very much clued in to what's happening around you. So you can pick up on stuff, variables, information, and things that you don't already know, but you're getting a sense from other people, what they're saying, what's happening in that situation, what happened in a previous company, what's happening with a competitor, for example. So you can pick up things through your situation. In other words, walking around with your eyes wide open. Okay, this is really what situational awareness is. So you understand the dynamics of what's happening right now in the current time frame. So we understand, as I said here, the linkages between people, places, and events. So different, an event that might have happened past in your past experience might have some similarities to what's going on now, but there could be different players, could be a different company, but there are very many similarities, and we use that past experience to help us in the current situation to be able to be more active. So I've experienced that before. I came across this before, and I understand what's happening here. However, there's a slightly different way, but maybe we have lesser experienced people, maybe we have more experienced people, therefore we can do it and move at a different pace. We can move probably a lot quicker, or we might have to slow down. So we're aware of the situation and the dynamics of that particular situation and event, and allows for inferences. And that's why I talk about your gut feeling or your intuition. We do all have intuition. We all have these gut feelings, and oftentimes we can infer, we can kind of picture what the future scenario or the result might be based on our past experiences and the current dynamics. We can say, well, this is most likely going to be the outcome of this course of actions. And then I'll compound all that by saying that we might have several courses of action. And we'll probably anticipate, well, if we do it this way, we'll get that result. If we do it that way, we'll get a different result. Or we do it this another way, we might get something similar to the first result, but it's better than the second result that we scenario that we tested. So we start to make these inferences. It's not guesswork. We're collating and gathering as much information, data and information, to enable us to make good choices. So you might have a whole range of choices in future scenarios, but you want to I'll use the word phrase or do a risk assessment. You'll do a prioritization, or you're doing the best fit evaluation, whichever you think, and you might prioritize those courses of action, those choices, and so on. But this is interesting. Last point here, the lack of situational awareness is primary factor for affecting human error. Absolutely. So people making decisions without being fully informed, or not being given all the information, or not having access to all the data. So they're clearly making bad choices. Now, none more so evident than in current social environments. We're using social networks. We're using Facebooks, Instagrams, Twitch, Discord, Twitter, so on and so on, TikTok. We're using it. But if you go into Facebook, for example, and you get so much information, or you get these headlines and so on that are presented to you, and you say, oh, geez, that was so bad and so on. And then you go in to read and say, hang on a second, this isn't quite the case. Point in case, this morning, I was looking at the news briefs before I started work, and there was this headline, Guardian fined and confiscated car on COVID-19 test checkpoint. I said, my God, this sounds serious. This looks as though that the police have stopped and taken the car off people. And this seems a bit, extreme, to say the least. And so that was the headline in the news, or in the news piece. So when I went in and looked at the piece and read down through it, and then buried in one of the paragraphs way down, they were talking about this checkpoint for COVID-19, and they stopped a car, and the occupants were fined €100 each for travelling, because they were coming from County Cork up to County Kildare, which is well outside the 5 kilometre zone, and so on. So they went on through all this ramble, and so they were saying, okay, this is making sense to me, but the article mentioned confiscating the car, taking the car from the owners. And to read one line in the middle of this, buried in a paragraph, the driver had no driving insurance. Only then. But so it's, my point being is that the headlines and the introduction part, without that, give a totally different picture. Give a checkpoint, taking a car from a COVID-19 checkpoint, and people's cars being confiscated. It was designed to impact us, but didn't give us all the information. If it had said car confiscated at COVID-19 checkpoint because driver was not insured, makes sense then. But we had to go to other levels. So this is how we can make errors of judgment when we're not furnished with all the data, or as much as is necessary for us to make good decisions. But also we can be at fault ourselves in terms of, I could have gone off and said, pass this information on. Do you see some guards took the car off some guy at a COVID-19 checkpoint? They're getting very serious about this. In other words, and this car was coming from Cork. They were well outside their flight. Maybe this is a new criteria and so on. So I could have assumed and made and passed this on as misinformation. Not purposefully, but I might have been blinkered and made this assumption. And that's what happens. And that's why social media can be so damn dangerous, when we don't take the time out to view from multiple perspectives, get as much information and so on, to be able to have an informed decision, an informed commentary, and so on in this area. So again, the sense making, so we use mental models from previous experiences. We have cognitive gaps between the mental models and the new observations or circumstances. So yes, we might not have all the information, as I mentioned previously in my conversation on this. So if we don't, we try to fill in the gaps. We might think back on previous situations, or we might have been told stories from other people, and that's what they did they did in this type of situation, and that was their experience. So can we fill in any missing pieces ourselves based on having a lot of the data already? Can we fit those missing pieces of the jigsaw into to complete the picture for ourselves at least? We may have to discuss with people. We may seek more information. But the whole point is we may have cognitive gaps. Everything doesn't fit together. There's something missing. And that's the important thing. There's something missing. Therefore, you need to ask, research, find out, and so on. What's missing? And then, is it valuable, or can you work without that missing piece? So the world is different from expectations. Of course, what we expect to happen and what actually happened can often be close, or they could be totally different. So and that's where the resilience comes in. If the reality, or in the future reality, doesn't measure up to our expectation, we may have a level of disappointment. But do we bounce back from this? How quickly can and this essentially is resilience. Or we may be so in tune with reality that our expectations and the reality are very, very close. And that takes a lot of pressure off us. That can reduce anxiety levels, for example, and stress and so on, is when we are very cognizant and aware of our environment and future states and expected outcomes. Therefore, you might have heard the expression, you set the bar too high. If you set too high expectations and the reality is down here, then you're going to be demotivated and unhappy, and so on, so on, so on. All the usual psychological impacts. So meaning arises from labeling and characterization, so socially defined and so it's not about the truth or accuracy, but updating plausible stories through dialogue. So we'll for to each and every one of us, the truth will mean something, and the important thing is, how do we actually get to the kernel, the cause, the detail, the truth. In other words, how do we uncover the knowledge that we need to be able to make a decision, and so on. We ask. This is through dialogue, questioning. So questioning, why this, why that? I don't understand this. Explain this to me. Show me that, and draw that. Do this. Whatever the case may be, this interaction. And remember, it's a two-way process, hence dialogue. So identity shapes our mental models and actions. So when we understand and we have a perception or an understanding of ourselves in a particular scenario, then we become more comfortable with our actions. That's essentially what it means. So then again, this is the uncertainty or sense making continued in visual format. Of course, it would have to be given my penchant for graphics. So we have all of this uncertainty in environmental changes, complexity, chaos, unintelligible uncertainty, and all of this is around us in every which way we look at. Even you'll have levels of uncomfort or discomfort in some modules on your program. Other modules you might be more comfortable. You might be quite proficient at maths, numbers, and so on. Therefore, you might find finance less of a challenge because you're good at numbers. But then throw you into marketing or psychology, and it's a chaotic world because it's all grey and so on. And you like to think in absolutes, ones and zeros, and numbers tell me everything. But now when we're dealing with people's feelings, emotions, situations, it becomes clouded, and there's a bigger gray area, hence ambiguity. And this is what causes uncertainty, and it raises complexity for us, and because we cannot see precisely what we need to do. And this is where it becomes, so we start to build these mental models, and we create these plausible stories to ourselves to make sense of it, and this gives us an identity of how effectively or not we can actually understand these situations. And as you can see, it's all about the sense making of situational awareness, understand what's happening right now, here and then, and how we understand what's happening, and based on that we can fill in the gaps, build our mental models, and say, well, if this happens in this situation again, this is how we can respond, or that's how we can respond, and so on and so on. So we start building these models for future. So it's like a little repertoire in our minds of courses of action that we might want to take down the road. So Huber, excuse me, Huber, back in 1991, he looks at knowledge acquisition, information distribution, information interpretation, and organizational memory. So, let me see, excuse me, excuse me. So, knowledge acquisition, so congenital learning, experiential learning, so experiments, self-appraisal, unintentional learning curves, vicarious learning, grafting and searching and noticing, scanning, focused search, performance monitoring, and so on. So these are mechanisms for us to be able to learn. And congenital learning right now in the present, experiential learning, learning from past experiences, and vicarious learning, being thrown into a situation, sink or swim type of thing, grafting, pure hard work, just get in and do it and keep doing it until it makes sense to you, and then searching and noticing, scanning around, is there other alternatives, and so all of these different ways of learning for individuals, but more importantly, knowledge acquisition for the team. So we do this on an individual level. We all have our own different styles and different ways. It's how effectively we share the process of how we're learning. Not just what we've learned, but also the process with others in our team. That might inspire them. So for example, I've already told you I use mind maps. I'm a great believer in mind maps. Now here's another insight into mind maps. You have probably used mind maps in software. I have yet to be convinced that software applications for mind mapping are good. I believe they're not, and I have very strong cognitive models to tell me so. In other words, you'll know yourselves that if you go down to and try this out if you wish, but when you're working on mind maps using software, you're probably sitting down, I'll put it into this box and then I'll put that into that box. Well, I'll change the text size and this, and I'll change that. And I might change the background color there, and I'll use a loop or I'll use a straight arrow, and I'll fill them all in. And then it begins to look very crowded, and I need to change all this. So you get swamped and sucked into the cosmetics of the software and try to get it out. Oh, that looks good now. But does the content make sense to you? Oftentimes that can be the huge challenge. Whereas I take physically manual mind maps for myself. I'll sit down and draw my center circle. This is the main theme that I'm trying to cover. And I go off and draw a bubble here and different square there, and they'll all make sense to me. And generally speaking, people can follow them because they're basic rules, core point, then the primary points, linkages, and you might label the linkages in handwriting. So, and that's the point. These mind maps are as unique as your handwriting. They're as unique as you as an individual. And it's when we put this knowledge down on paper, now we're beginning to share it so other people can acquire that knowledge that I have. So my process for doing something might be this mind map, and I've already described my process of using mind maps. So you see where this appears to be more complex than it actually is. Excuse me a minute. I should really stop and pause and start again, but no, I'm keeping going, keeping the natural flow of things. So this is what happens on an individual. So when we're swapping these ideas around, someone else in the group saying, yeah, okay, I see what he's talking about. This makes sense in terms of how to use a mind map. I might try it his way for a change rather than using the software. And then the team becomes more effective at documenting all its information rather than writing long manual texts. So, well, let's devise a sequence diagram or a workflow diagram. So now the team is learning how to do things more efficiently as such. Okay. So then the information distribution links with organizational communication. So the probability that A will route information to B, a member or a unit, and so on and so forth. So how effective? This is kind of where okay, let me finish out here. So probability of a delay in routing information by A to B, and then the probability and extent of information distortion by A when communicating with B. So just and in essence, what this is alluding to is oftentimes the politics inside. So can somebody actually relay the information to you? Will they want to? Is it in their best interests? What do they get back in turn? Do they see the bigger and there can be huge influences based on culture and so on. But let's not go into all of these different dynamics. But it could be a case that A might misinform B because they might not like B, or they might have B as a threat, or a manager might not give all the information to a subordinate. I hate using that expression, but one of his team. Because they say if he knows too much, then he could take my job, and so on. All this sort of stuff comes in. So these are the kind of distortions, and that makes it more difficult for the team members to say, well, I don't have all the information from a manager. Do I need to go elsewhere? And if I go elsewhere, will I be undermining my manager, and will this cause problems, and so on, so on, so on. I'm just keeping an eye on stats and time and so on. So all of these dynamics come into play in terms of information distribution. Now, this is where it comes into in terms of your own self-leadership and your comfort zones. So, you know, I would have said to students before, you know, that, you know, you get a degree, and of course you'd be delighted, and deservedly so. And then you go out into the workforce. Here's my piece of paper. I know all of this. Well, you've learned all of this. To actually say you know it is kind of goes back to what we're talking about here. Unless you've actually done it, you can't say that you really know it. Okay, but you have your degree, and you go out there. A degree has maybe at best 12 months shelf life, but it's something. What it tells an employer is that you have the ability to learn, and you have the ability to learn in different subjects, different areas, and so on and so forth. But your mind is capable of learning at an advanced level. That's the importance of a degree, because the content and the information and so on and so forth that you would have had in your degree could change in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and so on. So what you would have learned then may have become obsolete. Some of the stuff that I might be teaching may become obsolete, but most of the stuff has stood the test of time. But the point is that sharing the information and coming out, so we learn all of these new ways. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that we might not have all of the pieces of the puzzle, and then we need to find out what we don't know. And sometimes you might hear this being referred to as not knowing the unknown. So, well, if I don't know the unknown, why would I bother about it? Because it may affect you. Stuff might happen that you need to become knowledgeable about. In other words, learning. Over time in our careers, we will be constantly learning. We'll be learning new ways. We'll be inventing new ways. We'll be innovative in the way we're thinking about our jobs and so on, and how we interact with other people. Now, the point I'm really coming to here is that you need to be comfortable. You need to be able to share knowledge. Don't protect it because you feel that you become indispensable if you share your knowledge and share how you do. Because in mature organizations, they actually recognize people's contributions for the better good of the many. And oftentimes that can be underpinning your promotion and your opportunities within inside an organization, is how willing you are to share information, knowledge, and so on, to enable you and your team and the organization to excel or to improve or to do better in various areas. That openness, and you have to have that level of confidence in yourself to be able to share it and move on, because nothing is static. Yeah, there is a shelf life on everything. So your knowledge has a shelf life. You need to update your knowledge. You need to move on and learning. So that's why we have continuous learning. That's why you have programs inside an organizations for continuous improvement. It's for you to be able to benefit, professional development, and so on. And it's one of the key areas in companies now. If you know, I'm listening to my sons and daughters, stepdaughter, and my daughter and sons and so on. The key point is that they're telling me the same. They're working, you know, they've worked in LinkedIn, Facebook, Indeed, Workday, and where else? Google, Facebook. They've worked in all these organizations, but the common thread amongst all of them is what they're learning in the jobs, what courses they can take. Their degrees are defunct a long time ago. It's what they're learning and what continuous development they're investing in themselves, and that's how they share this information around and help each other to excel. So information and interpretation. So we have these maps, we say, we have this framing of an idea, and then we have media richness. So a variety of cues medium can convey and rapidly the rapidity of feedback and so on. So, you know, having a lot of data, having a lot of information and so on. So it's rich with content, and therefore because we have all of this information, it's how quickly we can assimilate all of the data and information to be able to take a course of action. And that's what we talk about when we talk about media richness, and you know, for example, when you're carrying out research methods or research for your dissertations at some stage. You know, I often tell students that, for example, interviews, rather than simple questionnaires, interviews they're extremely rich in data. And the reason for it so is because sometimes the person you're interviewing will talk about other stuff and above and beyond what you originally thought about. You mightn't have even thought of the question to ask them, and they'll volunteer more data. So they're a rich source of data, and as such. And of course, then we can have information overload, which detracts from the effective interpretation, and much of that is the challenge we have today. If you go onto the internet today, or you go onto Google and start looking at stuff, how many times have you fallen into the trap? And be honest with yourself. When you look at something, and then you went up in this thread, and then you went up in that thread, and then another thread, and maybe a half an hour later, 10 minutes later, 2 hours later, you wonder, what was I actually looking for here? Yeah, but that was interesting. But did you learn anything? Maybe you might pick up some more information. Will it be of use to you? Maybe, maybe not. But the point is, we can get distracted into looking at stuff that's not. So in other words, we need to stay focused. We need to look and try and draw limits as to what we need to find out. In other words, that we don't get totally taken off in a tangent in areas that would waste time, cost, or money. So that's important in from a company's perspective, that you know that there's limited resources, constraints, time and money. And then we have this unlearning, so discarding obsolete and misleading knowledge. So yeah, sometimes the expression you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, in reality you can. I'm in my 60s, and I'm constantly learning. I'm learning new ways of doing things. What I'm doing here, for example, this would have been unheard of a year ago, essentially, pre-COVID days, although we would have done some videos and so on. But we were doing stuff similar to this in organizations. We were using conference calls on phones, a big phone with a speaker in our desk back in the 80s, for crying out loud, and similarly, and then we started looking at the likes of Skype and so on, coming into 2000s and that. So all of this, the concepts of online interactions have been around for quite a long time, although they might have only been through telephone lines with a phone conversation. Now we have this little bit more sophisticated version of two-way communication or recorded information, whichever the case may be. But we have to undo, well, we did it this way before, is there a different? And I'm constantly changing the way I do stuff, the way I put all this together. For example, last semester I would have had about 6 different modules that I was lecturing on, and in my structure, because of the software I'm using, I use what's known as OBS Studio, which feeds into Zoom. So I have better quality using OBS, and I've discovered and learned this last year, rather than using the Zoom record function. But I can add all of this other stuff into it, the way I can move myself around the screen. For example, big zoom. Here I am outside here. Okay, bottom left, going back to where I was, I can go into what I call stand-up mode. So I can, if I'm standing out here behind me, I have all the room here I need behind me to be able to stand up and give a lecture as though I'm in a lecture room. So coming back to where I should be, bottom left. So all this meant I have a tablet where I have all this programmed. I learned all of this. And then some and so on. So it's a sophisticated system. 6 modules, and for each module I went through this process. I would have had an introductory scene and then a main scene, and I had different ones for each module. And the more I looked at it, I started thinking, well, I can simplify, I can uncomplicate this even further and further. So now today I'm looking at my system here. The software is over on that screen. My PowerPoints are on that screen, and I have my laptop down here in front of me. I'm down to 2 scenes, and I have nested all the other bits and pieces, elements, the tricks, the introductions, and so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. They're in another area. So what I learned, the knowledge doesn't become obsolete. It's the way I was using stuff has become obsolete, but the knowledge, the fundamentals of how I'm using is still current. That's important now. So we have to unlearn the way, I had to unlearn the way I did it and relearn to do it differently. So I have a different sequence of events, a different process to be able to do what I'm doing in this semester, and even to get the quality of my presentations and using different cameras, and so the fundamentals of what I learned previously are now valid today, but I had to undo the way I was doing things. And as little as as close as last week, it was last week, I reconfigured virtually everything here. I used to have 4 cameras, now I just have 2. I'm only using one. The other one is in backup just in case there's a fail. So I can now do everything with one camera as opposed to multiple cameras. Now, if I want to, I can add in the second camera just to give a different angle view and so on. But I don't need it right now. Yeah. So, and this is the point on learning and relearning or reusing some of the core concepts or ideas that we would have learned before and carrying that forward. Now, the important thing about here is no learning goes wasted. No matter what you learn, you might find a newer way of doing it. But at least the original learning, without that original learning, you wouldn't be able to find a better way of doing it and learn a new way of doing it, because you would have nothing to compare a benchmark back against. Okay, so organizational memory, so personnel turnover results in the loss of organizational memory. So non-participation of future needs means that memory may not be stored. So who has the information I want, and storing and retrieving the information, and computer-based organizational memories. All this is saying is that people come and go in organizations. And how do we trap or catch or acquire or store what people learn and so on and so forth? Well, there are processes. It's probably it's my area of expertise, knowledge management, all of this sort of stuff. And how do we do that? We ask people to document, write processes and so on. So most of it we can catch and retain within the organization. So people come in, they come in with certain competencies, abilities and knowledge and learning from another organization. They come in and join us and they say, hey Mark, this is how we did it in this organization. And I say, okay, so we can change our process and map it. And they say, yeah, this will work effectively in your organization. Straight away, I've tracked, I've captured the knowledge that this new person has coming into the organization. That's one mechanism. And conversations, videos, even conversations at a coffee table. You might be discussing, well, I had this problem before and this is how I solved it. So informal structures, and then you have the formal structures. Project meetings discussing how we did what we did, what lessons we've learned, and so on inside an organization. And then where do we put this information to make it accessible to people? Usually in the company library, a repository, and online, your shared folders, in company manuals and such and so on. And then you will have networks of people. For example, all the management consultancy, or the large ones at least, would have a network of experts scattered across the globe, and they have a way of finding quickly those particular experts in whatever country that has the knowledge that you need right here now. So if I'm in Ireland and I need knowledge about a taxation system in Trinidad, I can go on through with say McKinsey, and they'll have their own internal database. We even have it in third level. It's a SAP system for academics, so I can find out people. We've all sorts of repositories, so I can find out who are the experts in a particular area, and it might rank them based on the number of publications or years of experience and so on. So we have ways of trying to find out who has the knowledge that I might need or think I need in this current situation. And then we have the realist concept of organizational learning. So gunpowder has the necessary power to explode, but does not explode. It needs contingent condition. In other words, it needs a spark. So we need to have something in place, and that's why we have to put processes in place to enable us to be able to capture knowledge, and for organization. So when you have the right environment, so necessary power, experiential learning, vicarious learning, congenital learning, organization memory, and learning curves. When we go into a new job, for example, in a learning curve, we get introduced to a way of doing things, a process, and so on. And over time, we get better and better at doing that. We might improve it. That's a learning curve. It's simple as. But nevertheless, we need to have the environment, the social environment within the organization, which enables people to feel comfortable about learning. They're not afraid to make mistakes. They make mistakes, they learn from their mistakes, and they're also supported rather than penalized, for example. So contingent condition on learning information, interpretation information. So we need to be able to be flexible. And that's the key point in organizations, that we need to be flexible and adaptable to the different situations, because they will change. Nothing is written in stone. Things happen, causes a change in the way we're doing things. New technology from another company or a competitor comes in. We need to be able to respond. So we might have to undo the way things were doing before. I had one of those a dramatic example of that, two of them actually. One was when I first joined Ericsson. It was at the point where they were introducing the first digital telephone exchanges to replace the analog systems in Ireland. I came back many years later to run a project to do the same in Hungary, and we were introducing they were coming from their old electromechanical type exchanges in Budapest. They needed to upgrade those to the new digital systems, but then we had to get the systems to interact because of timing and issues and so on. And that was my project. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And then roll on 5-6 years after that, and we were introducing the first digital mobile telephony system. In 92 I went to Germany to work on those. So these were major changes, technological changes that were external, so we had to do things differently. We had to respond to technology driving forces of communications and so on. And so we were moving from analog fixed phones to digital systems, and then we moved from analog, the brick phones, to your entertainment devices as such. So constantly learning and updating and sharing the way things were being developed. And we share this around the organization. So what our team would do, we used to trap this information through our project meetings and best practices, best in class and all that sort of stuff. But we used to look, what we called it, what was known as the opportunities for improvement document. So each of my project meetings, for example, we would sit down and say, well, this is how we did things. Could we have done it differently? If so, how would we have done it? Where would we have made savings in terms of time, cost? Would we have jeopardized quality, or would we have improved quality? So all of these possibilities, and we document it, and we put that into a repository. And the next project, which would be running asynchronously to us, and say, well, hang on a second, that's so Mark has made a change to this process, and this is his experience based on that. Let's have a look at and see what he did. They looked at it, and they might find, we can improve it even more again in our project, in our type of project. We can make these additional changes, and they'd store it. Or they might find that won't work in our situation. So either which way, it was a win-win. Certain situations made it work better. Other situations, it won't work at all. So we were sharing this around, and that's the whole idea of sharing information. And it's an absolute golden rule of mine, philosophy that I live by. Information is power. Sharing it is even more powerful. Same thing for knowledge. Knowledge is power. Sharing it is even more powerful, because sometimes we don't fully understand the value of what we already know ourselves, and it could be absolutely critical to somebody else. That's why it's so important to be able to pass and share information. Hedberg talks about this unlearning process, through which learners discard knowledge. Unlearning makes a way for new responses and mental maps and so on. It does, but we take the knowledge, so we reconnect the knowledge in different ways. So, for example, you might have learned how to drive a car with the shift stick, manual gears, so to speak. Now, does that mean you have to go and relearn how to drive a car and all of that if you sit into an automatic? No, you have the fundamentals, you have the basic knowledge elements. steering wheel, accelerator, brake, and ignition, and four wheels, and rather than shifting and clutching, now the car does it for you. Just put it into drive and you find, oh, this is easier. So technology has made my driving style easier. Does it mean now that you can't, or if you learned in an automatic, you might have a slightly different approach to learning to drive in a shift stick? You might crunch a few gears, but the fundamentals are the same. Accelerator, brake, four wheels, steering wheel, and ignition, turn on, and you go. You might have a little bit of fun trying to find the gears and so on, but you get there. Fundamentals are set. So there's a certain level of unlearning. Some of the process is unlearned. So then we need to challenge and negate processes to unlearn worldviews. So again, the way things are already done, we need to question, essentially. That's what we're alluding to here. Challenge and negate and response, stimuli and responses. Looking at what the cause and effect. So do we understand the cause and what potentially are the effects of these causes? And if we take a different course of action, what are the potential outcomes based on that? And then challenge and negate connections between responses. So we might have this response, we might have that response. So in other words, alternatives. So when we analyze or evaluate and prioritize our course of action or our responses, and to see what might be an order, the levels of responses we might have, and the ordering, in other words, of the different responses, which is first, second, third, the priority of these responses, may themselves have constraints. Do we have time, money, people, and so on, and our equipment? These can all differ based on each of the different priorities, but we put in these constraints to give us some level of guidance in an organization. So organizational routines, for example, multi-actors, interlocking, reciprocally triggered sequence of actions are a major source of reliability and speed of organizational performance. So suboptimal performance when applied to inappropriate situations, and then link to procedural memory and skill and habit. So example, a single loop learning. So do as I say you should do, and we just keep on going. So we become robotic in doing what we're doing. In other words, we don't think for ourselves. So that's one possible way of enabling or getting people to do a precise set of measurements. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. The problem is that you're sacrificing possible improvements. People have thoughts and ideas and suggestions, and if you don't listen to them, then because of this single loop learning, just do as I tell you, because you're not listening to people, the people that are doing it, and you're given the instructions, because you're not listening to them, you're missing opportunities of improving the way you're doing things, creating new opportunities and so on. So that's, certainly one to watch out. So always be humble in terms of accepting that you don't know everything, and someone else, even in the lower part of the organization or whatever, or one of your team members, you might be a department manager, someone might actually know more than you, and that's important. So to know your role as a manager in an organization is not to give instructions and give orders and so on, it's to enable the team to function. Okay, that's really, really important. It's only a role like any other member of the team. There's no this hierarchical structure. Try and get that out of your heads. It's becoming obsolete, if not already, in many organizations. So the routines we have, we have a task or a problem, and we look at the way we're doing things. We have our social network in place, and then we have shared understandings, the power relations, performance expectations, and so on. And then we performance gaps, between reality and actually what's going to happen. And then the routine may change again, and so we go around in this sequence. And then we have these stories and paradigms and frameworks, which then become procedural memory. So based all of that synopsized down, we have problems and challenges, tasks in organizations. So we go through all these techniques, styles, ways of trying to solve these problems, and they become ingrained in the organization. This is how we do things here, type of mentality. And over time, these can change with new people coming in. New CEO could have a major impact on the way you do things around here. You might say, well, we need to take a more open approach. We may need to be more free with information. We may need to use more technology. So that's changing the procedure of how we do things. So in other words, the procedural memory is being changed simply by having a new CEO. Or there could be another expert or a couple of experts in another part of the organization who have brought new technology or new ways of thinking how things can be done. This can also influence the procedure. But fundamentally, we have stories and parallel. Oh, this is how we used to do this many years ago in this organization, and so on. And do you remember how we did that? And do you remember how we did this? All that can change because of technology, and of course it does. And of course, because remember, when I started out in accountancy in 1979, oh my God, 80, we had calculators. We didn't have computers. We had calculators with little rolls that so on. And then the first computers started coming in place, and we used VisiCalc, which was the very first format of a spreadsheet written by Dan Bricklin. I always remember. Dan Bricklin was in Harvard, and he supported the Harvard business students. They asked him, could you give us some kind of computer program that can add, subtract, multiply, and divide numbers? And that's where he came up with the very first version of a spreadsheet. Never patented, and as I said, the rest is history. But that wasn't the point. He came up with it, and now we use what do we use? Excel. Microsoft Excel is the default spreadsheet, which is extremely powerful. But I remember having to do things, and we'd have to manually type in commands onto the command line. Now you just click on an icon and off you go, and so on. So trust me, you don't know how simple life has been made for you. Anyway, the fundamentals haven't changed. We're still using a computer with a chip and needs to have a program. So dynamic capability, and so Zoller and Winter, dynamic capability is a learned and stable pattern of collective activity through which the organization systematically generates and modifies its routines in pursuit of improved effectiveness. Double loop learning, essentially. So learning mechanisms, experience, knowledge, articulation, and codification lead to dynamic capabilities, which in turn lead to evolution of operating routines. So what they're saying is that we openly discuss, document, codify, we document, we report on how we do things, the way we learned how to do what we're doing. And as I said, this all changes over time. That's why we have this dynamic situation in terms of learning. So how we learned stuff previously has changed today. 12 months ago, you would be learning stuff by me standing in the classroom, talking and walking around and so on. For today, you're learning stuff by me sitting in front of a camera, while you're at the other end of the camera, listening and talking interactively, using chat or maybe using voice. So subtle differences. It's not quite the same. We miss out on some of the key information, such as I might be looking at the way you react. I can't see you very clearly on the, as I call it, the crematorium, little holes with your names on, or boxes with your names on it. Whereas if I was inside in class, I could see if somebody is actually fallen asleep. You're probably looking at this stuff and gone for coffee. If you've gone muted and not on camera, and say, well, I'll look at the recorded version later on, and so on. So we're doing things different. Fundamentally, it's just a change. We've documented it. The fact that I've recorded it is documenting, is codifying it. Now, the only mechanism, we say the double loop here, is you might be throwing questions out there on chat. You might interject with a comment and so on, or you might send me an email. I don't understand this. Can you explain that? What's our assignment about? And so on. So that's where the double loop. So I instruct you even further. I give you more information to enable you. That's what I'm actually doing now when we're talking about organizational learning and your business model canvas. So social perspectives, Gerhardi and Nicolini. Learning takes place through interactions between people shaped by culture and norms. So the way we want to interact as people. Some people are more extroverted and others are introverted. Different cultures like to talk about stuff and so on and so on. And then social and political processes impact on organizational ability to absorb new. So, are people and the organizations open to change? Are they open to accepting new ways of doing things? If you look at Kodak cameras, and Kodak films, for example, they were resistant, and now where are they? Virtually, they were the go-to place when it came to films, black and white and color and so on. And then Fuji came in. Fuji moved on to different areas of business. Kodak didn't. The board were ignored. They were not aware of what was happening around them, computerization and so on, and didn't see the threat coming down the road. So they became obsolete. That whole division of there, they banked on one flawed understanding of reality, and that was, oh, people will always want to use film, the nostalgia of it. No, I mean, who uses film rolls nowadays? Other than for nostalgia, and that's, can you even see that gap there? So small. So similarities with social capital, and again, so what we know, so we have different levels of progress, different levels of knowledge, and so on. Essentially, that's what we're talking about here. And absorptive capacity. So ability of an organization to absorb and apply new knowledge. Capacity to learn and solve problems. Knowledge capacity driven by high previous experience and diversity and commonality. And last but not least, the knowledge capability driven by problem solving and knowledge transfer abilities. And the absolute last one there, gatekeepers important to transfer knowledge across boundaries. Really, this is the current environment. It's how quickly we assimilate what's going on around us, what's happening in the environment, in society, in technology, in business, in our competitors, how quickly we assimilate that and change our ways and learn, and it's that level of responsiveness and reactiveness, flexibility in doing what we're already doing and doing it more efficiently and effectively. That's critical to organizational survivability and so on, and that's really what we're talking about, our absorb capacity to be able to function more effectively. And this is just again shown in this diagram. High previous experience leading to an increased knowledge base. We have diversity and commonality. We have people with different backgrounds, different levels of knowledge, different experiences. That increases our capacity. And then we have problem solving capacity and knowledge transfer. So how quickly we can share information around to help us to solve problems. That's a capability. And these drive innovation and create and value creation. So it's how we do what we do and how we do it more effectively and efficiently. That's what's innovative. That's what innovation is. So you have creativity, the original idea, concept that comes up. Innovation is how you make that a reality, and that's what effectively underpins organizational success. So knowledge, new knowledge, technological and or scientific. So explorative learning to understand new knowledge. So new ways of doing things, new technology, going from analog to digital, going from cardboard models to using 3D printer for prototyping and so on. Learning these new ways using computer applications to solve problems as opposed to written documents, speed and efficiency and so on. So we're coming up then to buzz groups. Why are cooperative and competitive cultures both unlikely to lead to the most effective forms of organizational learning? So cooperation and infighting. This is essentially the politics inside an organization. So asymmetry of power, senior managers or middle managers, they can hold information, they can prevent information from being distributed around the organization because they may feel threatened by it. People who are experts within groups may not want to share information because, again, the culture or in the organization may penalize them. In other words, that they may not be recognized for the value that they're contributing to the organization. So all of these emotions, they can be joy and fear, can be the fundamental two emotions that can affect performance. All of these contribute to learning. So if and the cooperation, infighting, as I said, again, people disagreeing and arguments and so on, all of these interactions, and so they are very powerful in affecting the way you learn. So if you're in bad mood, and let's suppose you had a fight with your partner, wife, girlfriend, husband, boyfriend, all of them at the same time, I don't know. If you have a disagreement with them, it's probably going to play in your mind, and you bring that into work with you in the morning. Let's just say you had the argument at breakfast table with your partner, and you bring that into work with you, and you're thinking about this during the day. Clearly, it's going to affect what you're thinking of, how you're doing your job, and so on. So this is where the resilience element comes in. We need to have to be able to block that off, say at 9 o'clock in the morning, get on and do our job and so on. And then when we come on our return journey home that evening, then we can switch back and, okay, we had this situation this morning. Most often because you were able to compartmentalize your disagreement or your argument into its place and time, because now you have to work between 9 and 5. It often dissipates a lot of the issues and gives you clarity to be able to come up with a resolution, whether it's a simple sorry or whatever the case may be, dinner, flowers, chocolates, wine, whatever. But in any case, it enables us to want to enables our resilience to be able to compartmentalize and stay focused. Okay, so inside an organization, you will similarly have relationships with other people. Some people you'll get on very well with, other people not so well with, but that's reality. Some people are willing to share and you're willing to share with them. Some people might have taken stuff on you and taken some of your ideas, and you're reluctant to want to share anymore with those people or even with anyone, because that's all this place is doing, it's taking my ideas and they're not recognizing and so on. So you have to be very careful. These exist. So the only way you stay ahead of all of this is you keep refreshing, you keep learning yourself, and always staying better or one step ahead of as much as possible other people. So the Buzz Group, as they call it again, how does technology impact on the process of organizational learning, trust forming or electronic fences, so on? But what are the advantages and pitfalls of vicarious learning and grafting, and how can information overload be effectively managed? And that's what I mean by Buzz Group. You need to go off and have a quick think and talk about these and so on if you wish. But I'm coming towards the end now. So with all of this newfound stuff, information, knowledge and so on about organizational learning and what it means to you as an individual, and how we share it, acquire it, share it, and disseminate, distribute throughout the organization, the connectivity between this and the business model canvas is this. As a group or a team in a small company or in a large company, and you have to develop your business model, your business case, you need to find out, is this what the customer wants, for example? And you might go out and you talk to the customers and you need to bring that information back in and you share that around the place. You talk to your team and say, oh, I was talking to these customers and they're looking for this feature and they want that feature and they want to be able to do this, they want to be able to do that and so on. So you bring that and you share it amongst the team, and the team say, well, we can't do that, Mark, because we don't have the technology, or we don't have the resources, we don't have this. We can do this though. We can think of so everything is testing. You go out and you ask the customers, you bring it back in, and then you come up with a new version, new prototype or new version, or a pre-prototype, a pre-launch version, and you go back out and say, customer, is this what you want really? And they'll come back and say, yeah, well, the slight change. So constant learning. You're learning what the customers are wanting, and you're bringing that knowledge in, and you and your team are learning more about what the customers want, and that's how organizations develop. And that's why the business model canvas is so powerful. You're talking with partners, you're talking with customers, you're talking about with other teams in your organization, for example, and suppliers, marketing organizations, outsource capabilities, and so on. Whomever you're talking to, HR, finance, all these different functions within an organization, you're interacting with them, so you're getting more insight and understanding and knowledge. All of this contributes back into your business case, hence the business development side and the power of the business model canvas. It brings people, it raises you, and it helps you to ask questions and find out the information that you might not already know. For example, size of the market. How do you know? You go out and you survey, you ask questions, you explore, you find out how big is this market, what do they really want. That's information, that's knowledge, you bring that back in. That's why the business model canvas, for example, is so powerful in enabling organizational learning. That, folks, is essentially the essence of your assignment. Okay, and so you can just bring that a little bit further and so on, and look at these models and so on, how they can interact organization and why it's important. So, and then follow through on what's required in the actual assignment itself. But essentially, business model canvas and this slide deck plus some of the information on Moodle will give you all you need to be able to effectively carry out that assignment. Okay, folks, on that point, I'm going to finish up now. I'm not going to hold you any longer on this. Of course, do take breaks. Have a look at this on when it gets up there on YouTube. And yeah, we'll see you for the next lecture. Okay, take it easy. Bye bye. Bye bye.